Welcome to our panel discussion entitled 15 Years of the Istanbul Convention, Renewing Our Commitment to Women's Rights. This panel discussion is organized by ASIL and Solidarity with Others in collaboration with MEP Anna Schollenberg from Volt within the Greens EFA group. First and foremost, thank you all for being here. We're very pleased to see you, so many. Before we start with introductions, let me briefly walk you through how today's discussion will unfold. We'll begin with this short introduction to set the context and introduce our speakers. After introductions, we'll ask questions to our panelists that will highlight their expertise. Towards the end, we'll open the floor to you, the participants, for your questions and reflections. We encourage you to take part. Your perspectives are an essential part of this conversation. First and foremost, for those who may be new to ASIL or Solidarity with Others, ASIL is a non-governmental organization based in Strasbourg, founded in 2020. We're a young and energetic team dedicated to promoting, defending, and advancing human rights and fundamental freedoms, inspired by the values of the European Convention on Human Rights. We work at local, national, and international levels, always intending to bridge communities, institutions, and citizens. Next, Solidarity with Others is a Brussels-based non-profit organization founded in 2018. We are a team of lawyers, human rights defenders, and activists committed to promoting and protecting human rights across Europe and beyond. We work to raise awareness of human rights violations, give a voice for those who are unheard, and contribute to accountability and justice at local, national, and international levels. Moving towards the topic of this panel, which is why everyone is here, the Istanbul Convention, which was opened in 2011, established a clear framework to prevent violence, protect the victims, and hold perpetrators accountable. However, due to increasing political polarization and ongoing stigma, gender-based violence remains underreported and inadequately addressed. Legal gaps and institutional failures continue to leave many women in Europe without sufficient protection. Throughout this panel, we aim to examine the future of the Istanbul Convention, highlight expert voices, and most importantly, renew our commitment to this important document. At the same time, we want to address the growing challenges to this implementation and the consequences of political backtracking. Because if commitments like this start to fade, what's left is not neutrality, it's people being left unprotected. Let me now introduce our speakers who will bring their expertise and perspectives to this discussion. First and foremost, Anna Schollenberg, the co-host of this event from Netherlands, is a member of the European Parliament representing Volt Europa, sitting with the Greens European Free Alliance group. In the European Parliament, she serves as a member of the Committee on Agriculture and Development and member of the delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean. She is also a substitute member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Now let me introduce you Lisa Kolst. Did I say that right? Kolste. Great. She's a legal officer in the Gender Equality Unit at the European Commission within DG Just. It's just next door. She leads the implementation work following the EU accession to the Istanbul Convention and is also involved in advancing the Violence Against Women Directive. With over 15 years of experience in combating gender-based violence, including work within the United Nations and as a prosecutor in Sweden, she brings both legal expertise and practical insight to the issue. Our next speaker, Mrs. Anna Zobnina, joining us online. I don't know if she sees us. Yeah, she was there, perfect. She's the Strategy and Executive Director of the European Network of Migrant Women, a platform led by migrant women advocating for rights, dignity, and freedom of migrant, refugee, and minority women and girls across Europe. Through its wide network of organizations and activists, her work focuses on issues such as access to justice, anti-discrimination, economic empowerment, and combating violence against women. She brings a strong civil society perspective grounded in the lived experiences of the women these policies aim to protect. Our next speaker, Dr. Merve Reyhan Kaykıcı. She's a researcher at the Radboud University. Her work focuses on gender, human rights, and state-society relations, with particular expertise on Turkey and the broader European environment. Dr. Kaykıcı research examines the gender dynamics in both Turkey and Europe, with particular attention to patterns of gender-based violence, the implementation of protective legislation, and the role of civil society organizations in advocacy and accountability. And lastly, Mrs. Reem Al-Salim. Reem Al-Salim is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls since 2021. Appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, she brings extensive international experience on gender and humanitarian issues, including 17 years working with the UNHCR across multiple countries. Originally from Jordan, she holds degrees in international relations and human rights law from the American University in Cairo and the University of Oxford. Her work focuses on addressing gender-based violence in its many forms, including in context of displacement, conflict, and structural inequality. Sadly, Mrs. Al-Salim will not be able to answer the questions due to overlapping appointments. However, we have recorded message, and we will see her perspective by this message. Now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. MEP Anna Schollenberg. Here you go.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here with you all today and that we can host this meeting, this session. It is a topic close to my heart that we have been working on for quite a while within my team, and we want to organize an event on. I think it is a topic that should not fall from the agenda. Last mandate, it was a topic that was addressed a lot, gender equality in general, women's rights, and now we see that there's kind of a backlash on this topic. Although we still see that 1 in 3 women do experience gender-based violence. Very recent, there was a survey that also, again, proves that gender-based violence is widespread, that it's underreported, and many women suffer from this. And the topic, the Istanbul Convention, is something that I wanted to work on for a while, because I did one day a mission, I think it was a bit more than a year ago, to Bulgaria, to both research the asylum system there, because I also work a lot on refugee rights and women's rights. And then I asked a woman that works on this topic there in Bulgaria, like, what can we do right now to support you? And she said, make sure that every country in Europe does ratify the Istanbul Convention. And also make sure that there's no other country that retracts from the Istanbul Convention. So this is something that we have to keep pushing for, and especially in the year, this year where we mark 15 years of the Istanbul Convention, I think it's important that we again stress our dedication to it, and that we also come up with ideas how to strengthen it. And what I'm particularly worried about is that there are still 1 in 3 women that experience violence, but we also see this growing trend amongst young men who shift their perspectives on women. And if you now look at Gen Z men, we see that 31% believe that it's okay or that a woman should obey her husband. We see that 33% believes that men make better leaders than women. And 15% believes that's okay to slap your partner. So I'm afraid that we're not entirely going into the right direction, to put it mildly, and that we need a strengthened approach to this. So I myself look forward to concrete ideas how I can work on this topic within the European Parliament, and I'm also very much looking forward to other concrete ideas what we can do. Unfortunately, I am not by myself here in the Parliament working on it. I just saw Mark, my colleague, also walking in. Thank you for joining us today. A very outspoken supporter of, as well, of women's rights, LGBTQI rights. So we are here with a broad group of MEPs who do want to work on this. Yeah, so thank you for this, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Perfect. Let's start slowly with the panel, but I would also like to say hello to our MEP, Mark Angel. Thank you for being here. Starting with our representative from the European Commission, Lisa Kolste. Good, I said it well. So, do we have the presentation on? Perfect, it's coming up. My first question towards you is, how would you assess the implementation of the Istanbul Convention at the EU level, how since the EU's accession in 2023, Could you clarify which parts of the convention are now binding under EU competence and how this translates into practice for member states?
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you to Anna for organizing this very important event. We've met before in these contexts. My name is Lisa Kolste and I work at the European Commission, as mentioned. So I lead the work following the EU's accession to the Istanbul Convention, and I'm also in the Violence Against Women team. So we currently work with member states on the implementation of the Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which is the EU's key way to implement this convention. And I will get back to the details here and also try to clarify the links here between the Istanbul Convention and the Violence Against Women Directive, which are not very easy to understand for everyone. But before I start, and before I answer your questions, I wanted to give you a clearer picture of what violence against women actually is and where Europe stands today on this. And I know that you mentioned it, but I wanted to start by reading a book, which is a Swedish book by two journalists who have analyzed the killing of women in Sweden. So please, with the slide. So the women were between 15 and 91 years old and worked as lawyers, teachers, security guards, cantors, clerks, doctors, shop assistants, mechanics, flight attendants, and train conductors. Most were killed at home, in the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room, on the doorstep, or in the stairwell. The most common place of murder is the woman's own bed. They were killed with bread knives, axes, frying pans, telephone cards, ropes, lashes, swords, stones, crowbars, and tumbles. They were strangled or suffocated. 5 were burned to death, 3 were drowned, and 48 were shot. Some were trampled to death. Together, they left behind 246 minor children. For 179 of these children, it was the father who killed the mother. 92 were at home at the time of the crime. 51 saw their mother being killed. Several children tried to intervene to save their mother. As a mother of 3, it's very difficult to read the last line here, but I think this is important actually to make us understand what realities 1 out of 5 women live in Europe today. If we look at the next slide. So what I just read, it's 2 journalists who have analyzed women who have been killed in Sweden, which is once and again being assessed as the most gender equal country in Europe. So we mentioned this, or Anna mentioned these statistics before, but femicide still claims the lives of 18 women per week in the European Union, and this was also included in the recently adopted gender equality strategy. And also, I think this is from the Gender-Based Violence Survey, the other statistics, that 1 in 5 women face physical or sexual violence from their partner, a relative, or another member of their household. So I think this really shows we have to start by understanding the prevalence of this violence. And we have to, I think, understand that this is a crisis that we can no longer accept living in. The second thing we have to realize is that we can prevent this. We know how to do it, and it's not that expensive either. We have the Istanbul Convention, which provides the legal framework for how to end this violence. It's built around these 4 Ps of prevention, prosecution, policies, and prevention. And it spells out, I would say, the best practices on how to end violence against women. And actually, as one example, I just saw in the news in Sweden that actually last year was the first time that the number of women killed in Sweden started to shrink. Because Sweden have prioritized this by policies, but of course, even Sweden is not there yet. And this is actually a priority for the European Commission to combat violence against women and domestic violence and to implement the Istanbul Convention. So if you go on to that slide. The slide before, please. So, as you may know, last year the Commission adopted the Roadmap for Women's Rights, which reaffirmed actually the European Union's commitment to gender equality. It sets the long-term vision with key principles and policy goals to realize gender equality. And I would actually recommend all of you to read this roadmap because for once it's a very strategic document. And it really shows, I would say, the EU's commitment to gender equality. And if you go to the next slide, it's built around these key principles, and it spells out as the principle number one, freedom from gender-based violence, because there can be no gender equality in Europe without freedom from gender-based violence. So this key principle was, and if you go back to the previous slide, actually I should say that this document was endorsed by all member states, all EU institutions, all key stakeholders on 16th of October 2025. So we have agreed that we want to end this, and we have the legislative framework in place to do so. And it's also great to see all the people in this room really showing that there is also commitment to ensure this. If you go on to the next slide, and then the second slide. So, in 2023, the EU finally acceded to the Istanbul Convention, and that was thanks a lot to the European Parliament, the colleagues in the room who really fought for this. And I think this was a really bold step by the EU to sign under and agree to including the Istanbul Convention into the EU acquis, by binding ourselves to what has been called the golden standards when it comes to violence against women and domestic violence. And you may have heard that the EU only acceded to the parts of the convention that falls within the EU's exclusive competence, and that is those that relate to institutions and public administration of the Union. That basically means that all the EU's institutions, agencies, and bodies need to implement the Istanbul Convention and live up to most articles that applies to them, including the Parliament and the Commission, and also when it relates to judicial cooperation in criminal matters, asylum, and non-refoulement. When it comes to asylum and non-refoulement, I think my colleagues will talk about that, but there are basically 3 articles, and those are directly applicable because the Court of Justice have affirmed that those form part of the EU's exclusive competence. And then we also have what's called judicial cooperation in criminal matters. And I must say, when I got this job, I thought that judicial cooperation in criminal matters, that might be like probably 2 articles in the Istanbul Convention or something like that. But that's wrong. Actually, and listen now, because many are not really aware of that, but if you discuss the links with the Violence Against Women Directive and the Istanbul Convention, so as I mentioned, the directive was the EU's key way to implement the Istanbul Convention. And just to give you a crash course in EU legislation, so basically when you assess whether something, actually an article of the Istanbul Convention, falls within the EU's exclusive competence, you have to see if that article is reflected in the EU acquis somewhere else. So through the adoption of the Directive of Combating Violence Against Women, which actually builds on and reflects directly most articles of the Istanbul Convention, through that, all of a sudden, through the directive, the EU's acquis really broadened on this. So when an article of the Istanbul Convention is reflected in the Violence Against Women Directive, basically we can say that it falls under the EU's exclusive competence. I think I have a next slide, actually. So what I just said. So this is how this is actually explaining the link between the directive and the Istanbul Convention. So first you see first you have to see which article in the Istanbul Convention. Then you see, does this article fall within the exclusive competence of the Union? And then you see, does the relevant provision of the Istanbul Convention fall within an area already largely covered by Union internal rules? And here you should basically just see if it's reflected in the Violence Against Women Directive. And if it is, then that article in the Istanbul Convention falls within the EU's exclusive competence and thus fall part of the EU acquis. I think this is the most legalistic we will get today, I hope so. But if you get this, then you get more than many others, actually. To answer your question, so this was a long answer to a short question. So how would I assess the EU's implementation, I think, of the Istanbul Convention? As I just said, and we can also look at the previous picture, actually. So basically, as I said, the most articles of the Istanbul Convention today falls within the EU's exclusive competence and that are binding. But member states still have until 2027 to implement or transpose the Violence Against Women Directive. So we are still in the process of ensuring this. And I would say that this is really a momentum of opportunity. Now we should all go together, civil society organizations, politicians, institutions, researchers, to ensure this is really the time, because all member states have to live up to these provisions by June 2027. So it's a bit too early, I think, to say how well the directive has been implemented, or even the convention. And actually, the group of experts on violence against women and domestic violence is currently assessing how the EU is implementing the Istanbul Convention under the so-called baseline evaluation of the EU's implementation of the convention, and we can talk about that as well later. What Grevio normally says is that, because as you may know, this group of experts, that's because the Council of Europe, which leads the work on the Istanbul Convention, is based in Strasbourg, and they don't have the possibilities of infringement proceedings, etc., but they have a group of experts who assess and give recommendations to state parties. And they highlight what state parties should do to better implement the convention. And what they normally say when they assess the implementation of the convention is Europe is often that states often lack an integrated whole of society approach. And this is key here, because when we analyze cases of women who have been killed, when you look at the circumstances, often we can see that this could actually have been prevented if only all relevant actors had been cooperating, and this is also now in the Violence Against Women Directive. So if, for instance, the schools would react when they see that the mother arrives with a bruise, or if the doctor should dare to ask, are you a victim of violence? Here is a number to a shelter, I can take you there. If neighbors could start to ask questions or call the police when they hear the noise which they know is violence. And if social workers could start cooperating better with law enforcement. We have seen we have research on this. This is actually the way to end this. And also, I think, because violence against women and also intimate partner violence affects the whole woman's life, we have to start by supporting her in so many different areas. There's also often a need for improvement when it comes to victim support services, a sufficient number of shelters. There's often a need to improve the criminal justice response to ensure that we end the impunity that still exists. We need to enhance prevention mechanisms. That's often something that Grevio points out to, and also the data collection, to say something. I think I will end there, and then I hope that answered your questions. It was a bit long, but
no worries.
I was allowed, actually.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think it's very needed to put in the spot the most important part that we should, all of us, report when we hear something like this. Noises from our neighbor, cracks from the ceiling above, when there's fighting, screaming, and whatever. So I think this is very important to put this as an introduction to, Going to the next question, this might be a bit repetitive, but I think it's also good to remind this. Following the EU's accession to the Istanbul Convention, the adoption of the 2024 directive on combating violence against women represents the main step to implementation of the convention. Could you explain how the directive operationalizes the convention's provisions?
I can say that this is the main way for the EU to implement the part that falls under judicial cooperation in criminal matters. because there was other parts like asylum and non-refoulement, which is not covered by that directive. Well, if you look and start reading the Istanbul Convention on the one hand and the Violence Against Women Directive on the other hand, you will see that the structure is the same. The directive is also built on these 4 Ps of policies, which I mentioned before, and many provisions are actually pasted into the Violence Against Women Directive. So the links are very clear, and I said before, and also showed with this picture, most parts are actually of the Istanbul Convention are covered by the directive. What's not covered is many of the criminal offenses, because the Violence Against Women Directive only covers female genital mutilation and forced marriage. So the other criminalizations doesn't fall part of the EU's accession yet, because as you remember, you have to see if that article is reflected, and it's not reflected in any of the EU in the EU acquis. But then also the Violence Against Women Directive goes broader when it comes to many issues. For instance, cyber violence. It criminalizes the most common forms of cyber violence against women and girls. And also it obliges member states to ensure that these kind of pictures, etc., can be removed. And the directive also goes, I would say, into a bit more detail on when it comes to, for instance, investigations on what the law enforcement should do and the prosecution, etc., than the Istanbul Convention. So I think they complement each other in that sense.
Perfect, thank you very much. And last question before we move to our other speakers. Now that it is more of a, as for those that didn't study European law, now that both the Istanbul Convention and the directive are part of the EU legal framework, what does this mean in practice to the member states? What does it mean to be part of the EU acquis communautaire?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, now the Commission is supporting member states in implementing the directive by 2027. And by June 2027, they must be able to show for the Commission on an article-by-article basis that this has been reflected in their legislative frameworks in their member states. So the Commission is currently doing all it can to help member states in this. We had it last month, implementation workshops, when we basically go through article by article and explain how we expect member states to implement it. And we also have a prevention network of gender-based violence where member states, civil society actors come together and share best practices, because it's not just like, as anyone who has been working with legislation knows, that legislation is just words on paper until it's implemented effectively. So we want member states to learn from each other and implement the convention as well as the directive in the best way, based on the recommendations given by Grevio, this group of experts, because for once we actually have an expert group who has been explaining for years and years how to best implement these provisions. And as we also know that, and these provisions are strong, some member states will have to do and are doing a lot to live up to these requirements. And others will have to do less. So I think here the EU really has the advantage that we can learn from each other and we can create it for us. But I would say that the directive really demands action from member states. This is nothing that can anymore be explained as part of family life or private matter, because the directive requires a whole of society approach against this. And we can no longer have investigations going on for years and years without anything happening, because now investigations should be handled without undue delay, etc. And there also need to be a lot of criminalizations in place, and some member states are not dealing with cyber violence properly at all so far. So I would say that the main thing is that the adoption of the Violence Against Women Directive really demands action. And what I also wanted to highlight in light of what was said here initially is that since the EU has acceded to the Istanbul Convention, the parts of the Istanbul Convention that are reflected in the directive or that are reflected in the EU acquis, basically full part of the EU's exclusive competence, are binding on all 27 member states, even the 5 member states who have not yet ratified the Istanbul Convention. So actually, all EU member states are bound to implement the most parts of the Istanbul Convention, and we now have the EU's and the tools that the Commission have in place in case there is not enforcement, which means basically that not only the expert group, but there can also be infringement procedures, etc., in case articles are not implemented. So I really think that, as you said, that last legislative term, this was very much discussed in this House, and I know because I was also working here at that time, and I was following these negotiations. But now is the time for implementation. So now is really when member states are also starting to really talk about this, and we should all, I think, be part of this move. So I would also request all, I know there may be a lot from civil society actors here, to be a part of this and put pressure on this and ensure that member states really implement this as well as possible. So I think, this is how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for your being here and for your expertise. So, moving to our next speaker, Dr. Merve Kaykacı. I know you have a presentation. I know you want to present it, and I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you.
And I give you the microphone.
Thank you. So, just want to thank you for giving me the floor today. So in my bio, it's mentioned that I work at Radboud University, which is true, but for a very long time, I worked at a civil society organization based here in Brussels called Stockholm Center for Freedom. That monitored human rights violations in Turkey, and one of the biggest reporting we did at the time was on women's rights. So when I was asked to talk about, women's rights in Turkey in the aftermath of Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, I was like, where do I even start? But then I think the most basic thing that we need to talk about is the safety of women and girls and their right to live, basically. So I want to present a few important cases and put them in a context to understand how the current political situation in Turkey has had an impact on the protection of women and girls. Is my presentation on? No? Okay, well, let me just begin. So I want to begin with my first case, which has had a profound effect on me, but also has sent shockwaves throughout the country, especially among people who are working on human rights and women's rights. Fatma Nur Çelik, a 30-year-old mother, and her 8-year-old daughter Hifa were found dead in a coastal neighborhood of Istanbul. And it was not just an ordinary tragedy, it was actually a death that was a result of many warnings that were ignored. Fatma Nur Çelik, she had accused her husband of abusing her when she was a minor, and she was married off to this person, and then later this man started abusing their daughter from the age of 3. So before her death, the mother made her fears very clear to authorities. She filed a complaint against her husband, and she said she had been receiving death threats, and warned that if anything happened to her or her daughter, that she had no intentions of killing herself. But in the end, her death and her daughter's death were ruled a suicide. She also alleged that state officials had threatened to take her daughter away if she talked about what her husband had done to them. And despite all of this, and despite a lot of attention from women's rights groups across the country, she was still not protected. And actually, the first picture is of her funeral, where you can see a group of women's rights activists before the coffin of her and her daughter. So initially, prosecutors declined to pursue charges of child sexual abuse. And only after much pressure from women's rights organizations, charges were finally filed in January this year. But the court released the suspect, the accused perpetrator, pending trial. And the case was postponed. In fact, the next hearing will be in May. So justice was delayed. And as a response, so this is from the funeral. As a response, the mother, she started a vigil outside the courthouse. She stood there day after day, demanding protection for herself and for her daughter. And during this time, her daughter, she faced social exclusion, blame, severe psychological distress. She could no longer attend school, and she reportedly stopped eating. Can we go to the next slide? To the next picture, yeah. And you can see a picture of the mother and daughter before all the legal battles started. Because I think it's also important to remember the victims with the entirety of their life, not just as victims. So instead of supporting, what the authorities did was they imposed silence through a confidentiality order. So media was banned from reporting on it. And ultimately, they failed to protect the mother and daughter. And they were buried side by side. Their coffins were carried by women who, in their grief and anger, did not allow men near the funeral. And the anger is not isolated. It reflects a much deeper anger towards systemic failure to protect women and girls, because this is not just one case, this is actually a pattern. And we can go on to the next slide. All women and girls in Turkey remain at risk of violence and exploitation, and the risk has only intensified since Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention in 2021 through a presidential decree. And today, the protection of women in Turkey rests largely on domestic legislation, particularly Law 6284. And the law itself is as strong as its implementation, as you already mentioned. In practice, the protection is inconsistent, it's fragile, and increasingly politicized. In fact, there are ongoing discussions within the current government to repeal this very law under pressure from political allies. And this is a photo from the May 2023 parliamentary elections in Turkey, where the current AKP government was trying to form allies to have parliamentary majority. And you can see them shaking hands with another conservative political party, the New Welfare Party. And one of the conditions put forward by the New Welfare Party to ally with the AKP was that they repeal Law 6284, because it was discriminatory against men. And the definition of violence against women is too broad, and it needs to be revisited. And this law, essentially what it did was break up the Turkish family. So it was a danger to society. So let's be very honest about what that means. Women's fundamental rights were put on the table as a political bargaining chip. Can we go on to the next slide? And this is not just an isolated political talk. It's like it was handled even in the media. So Hilal Kaplan, a very conservative journalist close to Turkish President Erdogan, in her social media posts and in newspaper articles, she said that Law 6284 defines violence too broadly and invites state intervention into the domestic sphere. And conservative voices have similarly claimed that the law undermines the Turkish family, and it reflects a broader lack of political will. Now, I don't usually rely on numbers, but in this case, I think the scale demands it. Can we go on to the next slide? So there is a website dedicated to monitoring and tracking the number of women who fell victim to femicide every year. And this is the number from 2025. So 457 women were killed or they died under suspicious circumstances, and their deaths were not investigated. According to monitoring platforms, 32 women were murdered by men in Turkey in March this year alone. Another 58 died under suspicious circumstances. What that means was their death was either ruled as a suicide and was not investigated, or it was ruled as suspicious, but again, it wasn't investigated. Most of these women were killed by current or former partners. Many were killed for simply making decisions about their own lives, such as seeking divorce, rejecting a relationship, or asserting independence. And this violence persists in a climate of impunity. Courts have repeatedly been criticized by women's rights organizations for issuing reduced sentences, often citing so-called provocation. Article 29 of the Turkish Penal Code allows sentences to be reduced if the perpetrator claims they were provoked. But what constitutes provocation, in practice, it can be anything. It can be a woman asking for divorce. It can be a woman refusing reconciliation with their partner. In some cases, even a verbal disagreement can be counted as disagreement. Selin Nakupol, who's a lawyer and also a women's rights activist, She pointed out that in a deeply patriarchal context, the threshold for provocation becomes dangerously low, while the consequences for women remain devastatingly high. And we have seen this in many cases. If we move on to the next slide. So, in a highly publicized case, the murder of 27-year-old Pınar Gültekin was handed down a reduced sentence of 23 years on the grounds that the victim had provoked him. Forensic investigations revealed that the woman was strangled, put in a barrel, and set on fire. And while all this happened, she was still alive. Her stalker, who did this, Cemal Metin Avcı, even confessed to the murder. But because he had been provoked, he had been handed down a reduced sentence. Burhan Dursun, another man who killed his wife Tuba Dursun in front of their two children in October 2021, his lawyers said they would appeal for a reduced sentence on the grounds that his wife had had an affair. But his family, who talked to the media, said the man was a very jealous man. He was extremely jealous, and he had inflicted psychological violence on his wife and children throughout their marriage. So you can see how lawyers who represent these men already plan within this practice of impunity. And we've even seen reduced cases justified by claims as absurd as high blood pressure, I cannot contain my anger, I have diabetes, I lose control easily, and so on. And this is not justice, this is a normalization of violence. And at the same time, we see a very different reality emerging. Turkey's domestic violence reporting app that was developed by the government, KADES, has been downloaded over 9 million times, with nearly 100,000 emergency reports submitted since it was developed in 2018. So this is an app where basically if women feel threatened, they can just press a button, and the police needs to be at the spot at that time. It's not just used in domestic violence cases, but anytime a woman feels threatened. But in practice, what happens is that law officers, enforcement officers come very late, maybe half an hour after they receive the signal, or they come and they find that the incident was blown out of proportion. Why are you calling us for something as simple as this, like a domestic dispute? And they tell women that if they use this app, in cases where they're not really in danger, then they will face legal persecution themselves. So this tells us something very important, that women are seeking help, they're speaking out, but the question is, are institutions listening to them? Can we move on to the next slide? In 2020, Deutsche Welle Turkish Services published a report based on interviews with Turkish women, and these women described the police as ineffective in protecting them when they reported domestic violence. The women said they went to the police time after and again asking for help, but to no avail. That their husband beat them, they forced them inside the home, they locked the door on them, their children were threatened. But each time they went to the police, they were told to reconciliate with their husband. In the cases that women obtained restraining orders, those orders were not enforced. So the man was easily able to come back to the house, and then they get other threats like, we're home alone together now, the police cannot protect you, etc., etc. And all this happened within the knowledge of the police. So what essentially is the case is that domestic dispute and domestic violence is not taken seriously. And people who have the duty of responding to women's cries for help, they're not really educated or trained in this area to recognize the implications of domestic violence. And this is a reality that we must confront. Restraining orders are not being enforced. Women are left alone in their homes with abusive partners, despite repeated warnings and police awareness. And at the same time, the government is actively exploring ways to repeal the very laws designed to protect women and girls. But even in this environment, women's rights organizations in Turkey continue their work. They monitor cases of violence, document abuses, and bring visibility to stories that might otherwise be buried. When women die under suspicious circumstances or when their deaths are hastily labeled as suicide, these organizations push back. They organize protests, demand proper investigations, and like I said, organizations like mine at Stockholm Center for Freedom, we heavily relied on their work because it's really hard to obtain data on violence that occurs in intimate spaces. But for doing this work, they're also increasingly being targeted. Their efforts have drawn the attention of authorities, of course, not in support, but in repression, and activists face arbitrary investigations, legal harassment, and prosecution. So we can go on to the next slide. It's okay. In 2023, Narin Gezgür, a founding member of Rosa Women's Association, was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months in prison on terrorism-related charges. In 2022, authorities initiated legal proceedings to shut down the We Will Stop Femicide platform, which is a very well-known women's organization that counts the cases of femicide. And the accusations included so-called illegal and immoral activities and damaging the Turkish family structure. The platform has made it clear that these actions are intended to silence those who expose gender-based violence and hold authorities accountable. And these concerns are not isolated. So last year, 3 UN special rapporteurs, together with the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, raised alarm over what they described as the suppression of women's rights defenders in Turkey, and they warned that counterterrorism laws and provisions of the penal code are being misused to silence critical voices. So to conclude, and we can go on to the very last picture. 5 years after Turkey's unlawful withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, the situation for women's rights is more dire than ever, and women across all walks of life in Turkey remain vulnerable to violence and especially femicide. And the cases and figures I've presented today are not isolated. They are evidence of a systemic reality. Legal mechanisms may exist on paper, but in practice they too often enable impunity for perpetrators. At the same time, those who challenge this system, organizations and activists working to expose violence and demand accountability, are increasingly stigmatized and even prosecuted as so-called terrorist actors. So in this context, I believe our responsibility is clear. We, those who are outside of Turkey and those in positions of influence, must stand in solidarity with the women of Turkey, not only in our words, but through sustained attention to their work, through pressure and action.
Thank you very much for your contribution, your expertise. It's very important for us to see a perspective of a country that is not in the EU and it's not protected by the acquis communautaire, to see what happens when a country withdraws from it and how it affects day-to-day lives. We have a couple of questions for you, but I would, however, ask to answer quite shortly because we are running out of time.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Thank you very much. Do you think underreporting still plays a major role? Or is the main issue the state's response to reported cases?
Yeah, I think both. The problem, the situation with intimate space violence, domestic violence, is that it's really hard to keep track of this, right? And like I said, the definition of violence is very vague. According to women's rights organizations, anything from physical, psychological violence, sexual violence, to economic oppression of women, especially those women who are homemakers, right? They don't work outside the household, constitutes as violence. For the government, this is obviously not the case. So they don't report or keep tabs on this as cases of violence. The only way that domestic violence becomes very clear is when it ends up in the hospital or when the woman ends up, unfortunately, having died. So underreporting is a major issue. That's why we really need to focus on supporting women's rights organizations who work day to day on the ground, who do their best to monitor these cases and do not accept it when a woman's death is ruled as a suicide. Right, and that's another thing. But at the same time, the practice of the law that exists is also very, very insufficient at the moment. And we can go into this obviously, but yeah, I've already mentioned how law enforcement does not take domestic violence seriously, how there is a kind of propaganda of keeping the family unit very private and very segregated from society, which is making it very difficult to have these cases be visible and documented.
Thank you very much. Last question. This is more of a question that actually is for us to take a reflection on. Do you think international pressure, such as from the EU or the UN, can realistically influence domestic change in Turkey?
No, I wish I could say yes, but I think we have to be very realistic. I don't know what international pressure would look like at this moment, because there's a lot of different dynamics that inform what is, what needs to be pressured. And unfortunately, we've heard also in the EU, like there's a lot of issues surrounding women's rights and the safety of women. But what we need to do as a collective, people who do take this matter at heart and who are very concerned, is be aware of the reporting that is being done from that country, be aware of the numbers that are being reported and the cases that are being documented, and take that very seriously and show solidarity with people who are doing the good work on the ground.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I might give the floor to our Mr. MEP, Mr. Mark Angel, if you want to add anything until we resolve these problems.
First of all, I want to thank Anna and Volt and the Greens for organizing this, and the cooperation with civil societies is very important. After listening to all the experts and what I hear here, it motivates Anna and me and many colleagues to continue to, first of all, not only fight for women's rights and fight for the better implementation of the Istanbul Convention, but to defend civil society and academia, which are very much under attack too by these same people who want to undermine women's rights. And I think this is something very motivating. And we heard a lot of ugly things today, unfortunately, and it makes us aware that we have paper is not enough. The directive is there now. We have to make sure it is well implemented. After 27, we will see more, and I hope that there will be a good monitoring, not only of the Parliament, but also you, civil society, and working with us to really make sure that 15 years after the Istanbul Convention and now a few years after the directive, we really can see that hopefully the numbers will go down. So no, thank you for organizing this. I have maybe later further questions, but I'm here to listen and of course also to support a colleague. She hasn't been here in the last mandate. That was a much more joyful mandate. We had more successes. We could move things. This mandate is unfortunately a bit like we just try to make sure that not too much is being destroyed, but it also motivates us again. And thank you very much. And academia and civil society, for me, you're the best allies we can have as politicians, and you're certainly not enemies as it is being portrayed now. We were happy that we could avoid a committee on investigating funding against civil society, because they've been scapegoated a lot. There's a working group now. We couldn't prevent that, but really count on us, at least the pro-European, the pro-democratic. I hope that all from that coalition will continue to defend civil society, academia, but also women's rights in general. And I share the same worry as Anna with the toxic masculinity and all these influencers. And I will just share a brief story, one minute. A lady came to my office. She works here in the Parliament, a single mom, has a great career, works tough, and on a Friday evening she was cooking at home, single mom, and at a certain moment she said, "Hey boys, she has two boys, one of 14, one of 17, and she said, "Hey boys, can you just help me a bit?" And then they said, "Well, Mom, that's your job to do that. You're the woman here." And then the little one, the 14-year-old came. She was really shocked, and the 14-year-old came and said, "Well, we are following on Instagram Andrew Tate and a few others." And this woman then sat the whole weekend with the kids. They were watching this, analyzing it, discussing, and she told me, I think I recuperated them, but if that moment hadn't happened, then this would have gone on for months. And this is something which is worrying me very much. And even when you mentioned 15% of the Gen Z people say it's okay to slap your partner, that is really worrisome. And it's also in defending our digital services act, making the platforms accountable. This is also part of combating violence, and that's what we have to do. And this is again an event that motivates us to fight harder, to make all our instruments work. So thank you for all the work, and Anna, thank you for having launched this great initiative.
So now, as I mentioned before, our UN speaker can join because she had meetings. However, we have a recorded message from her.
Madam Chair, honorable members of the European Parliament, distinguished colleagues. It's an honor to address you today on the occasion of the 15 years of the Istanbul Convention, a landmark instrument that remains the most comprehensive and detailed regional treaty on violence against women. Allow me to begin by reaffirming what I have consistently stated throughout my mandate. The Convention represents a historic achievement. It builds on decades of international law, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the Beijing Platform for Action, by recognizing that violence against women is a human rights violation, requiring coordinated, comprehensive, and sustained state action. It provides a holistic framework grounded in prevention, protection, prosecution, and integrated policies, the so-called 4Ps, and has contributed to tangible progress across Europe, legislative reforms, improved services for victims, and greater public awareness. And yet, 15 years on, our task today is not only to celebrate, but to reflect honestly and to act decisively. The Convention's strength remains undeniable. It establishes a binding due diligence obligation on states to prevent, investigate, punish, and provide redress for violence against women, an obligation firmly rooted in international human rights law. It recognizes that violence against women is both a form of discrimination and a manifestation of historically unequal power relationships between men and women. It is reinforced by a strong monitoring mechanism through Grevio, which provides indispensable oversight, comparable evaluations, and expert guidance. And importantly, it has served as a driver of national reform, informing legislation, national action plans, and institutional coordination across Europe. However, at the same time, we must also confront a troubling and increasingly urgent reality. The Convention is facing sustained political and ideological pushback, not only through rhetoric, but through legislative attempts to weaken, delay, or withdraw from it. Such actions constitute a real risk of regression. As emphasized in recent statements, including in relationship to the developments in Latvia, dismantling or withdrawing from legal protections against violence constitute impermissible retrogression under international human rights law. We must be equally clear in addressing one of the central drivers of this pushback, misrepresentation about the Convention's use of the term gender. Contrary to some misconceptions, by the way, the Convention does not redefine sex, nor does it pretend to erase the consideration of sex as a distinct ground on which women and girls are discriminated against. After all, the Convention is a convention that applies to women, who are by definition female, and specifically mentions that discrimination on sex is prohibited. At the same time, and as I've said before, we should not conflate the term sex with other terms that appear in the Istanbul Convention, namely gender and gender identity. This conflation has been used to generate confusion and resistance, and has been used as ammunition against the ratification of the Convention. It is therefore essential that we restate clearly and accurately what the Convention does and does not do. Even where political commitments exist, implementation remains uneven and insufficient. Across Europe, we continue to observe underfunded services, unequal access to justice, weak enforcement mechanism, and insufficient coordination across institutions. We are also seeing a weakening of financial and political support to women's organizations and civil society organizations that support and assist women victims of violence. And there is a troubling move to adopt sex and gender neutral services, programs, and language. In some cases, reforms introduced under the Convention risk being destabilized or reversed, particularly where political support weakens. This underscores a critical point. Ratification alone is not enough. Without sustained investment and accountability, the Convention's protections remain incomplete. And I think we see that nowhere more clearly than in Turkey, which hosted the signing and and coming into being of the Istanbul Convention, yet Turkey withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, which is really unfortunate. There's one also group of women that I wish to specifically comment on. The convention explicitly recognizes that violence against women may constitute a form of persecution under international refugee law, requiring gender-sensitive asylum procedures. And it recognizes gender-based persecution, which is really a major legal advancement. Yet despite this, many migrant and refugee and undocumented women today in Europe remain excluded in practice from the application of these articles. They continue to face barriers in accessing gender-sensitive asylum procedures, protection and services. Refugee women and others in need of international protection continue to fear detention and deportation. They must therefore remain locked in abusive relationships in order to continue to secure their legal status, and they experience a lot of discrimination by institutions. So therefore, there is a risk that the object and purpose of the convention for this group of women is undermined. The convention also, we must remember, does not exist in isolation. It forms part of a broad legal framework that includes, as I mentioned, various international human rights treaties, but also the European Convention on Human Rights. And weakening the Istanbul Convention, therefore, has system-wide consequences. And it would undermine the state's abilities to meet their obligations across these frameworks and risk creating gaps, fragmentation, and inconsistency in national responses. Within the European Union, its standards are reflected in binding instruments, including in the Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. So retreating from the Istanbul Convention risks misalignment within EU law and obligations. So what is required now is not new standards. As we said, the Istanbul Convention is a very good, in fact, excellent instrument, but we must do better on implementation. We must fully implement the convention in law, policy, and practice across member states, and ensure adequate and sustained funding for services and service providers and victims, and we must strengthen monitoring and accountability mechanisms. We must also provide the necessary support to the monitoring mechanism, which is Grevio. There has to be also more attention given to guaranteeing that all women without discrimination benefit from the application of the Istanbul Convention, and that can only happen if there's also better institutional coordination. Prevention, despite it being one of the 4 Ps that the Istanbul Convention emphasizes, continues to be deprioritized and underfunded, and that has to change. So, honorable members, 15 years after the adoption, the Istanbul Convention stands at a decisive moment. Its standards are clear, its obligations are binding. There can be no retreat from the protection of women and girls, and any attempt to weaken, dismantle, or withdraw from this framework is regression, is a violation of fundamental principles of international human rights law, and risks exposing women to re-victimization, but also to greater harm. Therefore, I urge you to act with clarity and resolve, to fully implement the convention, to urge your states to fully implement it without delay and selectivity, and to guarantee protection for all women, including migrant and refugee women, without exceptions. I thank you.
I think.
Before we conclude, sadly we have our technical difficulties. We will have to skip one speaker. But yeah, before we move to the Q&A part, I give the floor to Ms. MEP Anna Strollenberg for her final speech.
Well, speech, I Thanks. I really appreciated the meetings or the presentations that were given today. So thanks everyone for this. It's unfortunate that we could not hear the last story, I think, which focused more on refugee rights. It's also another topic that is very close to my heart. I work on this a lot, on the topic of migration. I've been traveling to Albania to see what's going on there. Soon I'll go to Uganda. So it's, well, we can organize a whole different event about it. But for now, to conclude on this, I think every time I hear stories about specific women, how they are, what happened to them, how they are killed, the fact that these murders could have been prevented, that, well, first of all, brings chills to my bones, to everything, but also it motivates me a lot to keep working on it. And this is what I keep hearing every time. It can be prevented. It can be prevented. We have the legal instruments. We know what to do. We just need the political will. We just need to put the money where the issues are and make people and then time and space available for this. Over the last year, I've met with many people who run shelters here in Belgium or in the Netherlands. And I think there are so many people who want to work on it, but they often lack the money. So I think for us here in the Parliament, it's to make sure that resources are available when we talk about gender-based violence, but especially in member states, because it's often arranged at the member states level to make sure that money is reserved for this. Right now in the Netherlands, we have a very progressive government, which is great, and they say they want to work on this topic, but then there's no money attached to it, and I think that's problematic. So for us now, I think the main message that we have to take away from today is that we can all make a difference as well. If we take this moment until 27 to pressure our national governments, to pressure also the European government to keep this topic on the agenda, to make concrete plans, to not, because it goes further than ratifying a convention. I think the next 15 years should all be about execution, execution, execution. So we can make sure there's less and less gender-based violence, there's no more femicides. That would be the ultimate ambition. I think that's also where we have to go for zero femicides. And I know that I at least, and Mark and my colleagues will keep trying to put this on the agenda. I'll leave it with this, and again, thank you for joining, and I hope you want to keep fighting for this cause together.
Thank you so much for your ending speech, let's call it. And also thank you for our speakers for the insightful and thought-provoking conversation. I give to Konstantin to work on the Q&A part, but before we conclude, we have now a 20-minute Q&A session, and please feel free to ask any questions you have to our speakers. We encourage you to share your thoughts, and if you could just introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, what we could do is each one of you can first ask your question. We can gather a couple of questions and then we can forward them to our speakers, and thus we can continue the discussion. But before that, I would really like to make a remark, something that definitely touched me also as part of organizing this event, but probably personally I couldn't really get into the depth of the problem until now, that sometimes, unfortunately, we need to hear those brutal examples to understand how severe the problem is and to keep it alive in the agendas. And unfortunately, we get those chills, and we need to keep them in order to prevent such things from happening again. And probably I would like to share one question from my side that definitely I think it would be important, probably to you, Ms. Kekce, but also to the rest of the panel. You mentioned a couple of times about the general rhetorics in societies or in countries where society, or at least authorities, are more or less countering the Istanbul Convention and are not in favor of it. And it's the rhetoric of preserving families' private unit, or the fact that the Istanbul Convention is opposing, in a way, family. How do we explain even lighter and even clearer the fact that the Istanbul Convention is totally not opposing or is not against a family where relations are built on trust, dignity, respect, love, and care. Because this is, for us, it might sound very, very clear and logic, but apparently many people fall into the trap of those rhetorics against the Istanbul Convention. And I think it's important to address that, and as our event is doing, to sensibilize and visualize that the Istanbul Convention is not a threat. It's trying to help. And I also give the floor to other questions that we might have. Yes, we have one question here.
Hello, my name is Marie Thirion. I'm a student in journalism here in Brussels. It's kind of a question about your stance, but also a statement from myself, because listening to Mrs. Reem Al-Salem's speech, I was a bit alarmed by her trans-exclusionary statements. She was talking about how she is against the focus on gender and how she doesn't really want to have this inclusive vocabulary included in this fight. And I'm a little bit worried about this, actually, because I feel like if we start excluding trans women, which are some of the women who are the most persecuted within the umbrella term for women, then I feel like we are not going to really advance in the cause. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the question. Do we have any other hands raised? Okay, we'll first get the question over there. Yes, present yourself briefly.
My name is Mariam. I work at Solidarity with Others, Brussels-based human rights NGO. I have question to Dr. Kaikci. Given the Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention and ongoing debates and concerns, how they have this inadequate protection on gender-based violence, domestic violence, do you think European Court of Human Rights should take more assertive and active steps to enforce the state's positive obligation and address the systematic failure in Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We have one more over there.
Yes, thank you for, first of all, the discussion, especially in light of the Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is so important, and bringing the topic about toxic masculinity. There was a case in Leuven where there was a student gynecologist who sexually assaulted and raped a student. And unfortunately, he was only found guilty, but there was no punishment given. And as we were talking about women losing faith in the judicial systems and law enforcement, so my question is that what sort of protection mechanisms needs to be changed or introduced so that women, especially those that are marginalized or migrants or international students, can recover that faith in our judicial systems? Thank you.
Sorry, yes, your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for all the valuable inputs today. As I mentioned, I am a former trainee for gender equality, and I wanted to raise a topic of police level because resistance is particularly visible at the police level, and femicide is often perceived as outside of their mandate. And authorities also struggle with the gender motivation element of killings. So the femicide is often perceived still as homicide. So I wanted to ask what can be done in this field? Where do you see the room of improvement in this legal aspect? Thank you.
All right. Probably we already have 4 or 5 questions that we can start addressing. And we'll get back to other questions. Hopefully we'll have more time, so keep your thoughts. We might start with, first of all, who is more prepared or comfortable replying? Probably to my question first, or the ones with... Yes.
Go ahead then. I just want to say all the questions were so compelling and so relevant and really something to think about, actually. But starting from your question about how to explain that these provisions are not a threat to the family. but something to maybe actually make the family a safe space for everyone, children and women. It requires a huge cultural shift, I think, and it first needs a discussion and debate, open debate about what we think the family is, right? Is it because, so the Turkish government declared the year 2025 as the year of the family. And the idea behind that was the low birth rates in Turkey. And actually, this is a global phenomenon right now, right? Lower birth rates. And the reason for low birth rates is insecurity, economic, deepening poverty, and the people not being able to have trust in their future that they want to have children, basically. So instead of finding a way or developing policies to ensure that people have a safer future, right? They have better financial means to start a family. The government, what they did was they declared the year of the family and introduced several policies and practices that essentially made women confined to the household, right? So they have no other option than to have babies, basically, to put it very, very simply and bluntly. And the whole idea of reconciling with your partner who's abusive, having no other financial means than to have to depend on your husband, this is all part of the policy. So instead of declaring it the year of the family and making sure that the household is a safe space, right? Through law enforcement, through legal practices, what the government did was say, well, you have no other option. And what happens in the family stays in the family. So if you have a problem within your household, the only way to solve this is through your own domestic means. Like you cannot apply for any legal remedy. So this is what the family has become. And this is another cultural shift, right? Our understanding of what a family is also influenced by these policies. So we need a different kind of cultural shift to say, well, this is not what a family should look like. It should be safer. And the only way to do this is to practice the law. And then not to normalize these narratives where journalists or people who have influence over the public can openly start talking about how these laws define violence too broadly, that they're sexist, favoring women against men, right? And then to allow spaces for people who are in the right mind to have these discussions, psychologists, I don't know, social service workers, all these people who are on the ground, who work with victims of violence, who have a different understanding of what a family should look like, should have more space to talk about these issues. I think the media is a very important platform where this should take place, but what can you do when the media is also owned by the government? Like, these are all interlinked kind of different areas, so I don't have a solution for this. But like I said, there has been too much open and vocal expressions of opinions, debating whether these laws are just too much. We should have counter voices included as well. If we cannot do it within that certain country where these things are taboo, then we need to do it from outside. That would be my answer to your question, basically.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Moving next with the question that we have received for the trans exclusionary remarks. Unfortunately, we don't have the speaker herself to present herself. I don't know if any of you could make a short remark on that.
Maybe just for me, that I fully support your worry, and this is something that we see as well, and I do get some emails about this, so people do support this, but for me, it's not something that I would follow. I don't know, maybe Lisa has other ideas about this and how to specifically, if this is then the way to go, or if we should have another tool to specifically protect a trans woman, but I think this could be combined, yeah. Or Mark, yeah.
The good news is, of course, we've been protecting trans women also when we did legislation in the last mandate. And what is interesting, I was working on the Pay Transparency Directive, and we used the case law of the European Court of Justice because the legal basis for the pay transparency was equal pay between men and women, and it's in the treaty since 1957. So we had to stick to men and women, but we wanted to broaden it, and I wanted also trans people and get a bit out of this binary. So we took the case law of the Court of Justice, which is clear that over the last 70 years, the concept of men and women has very much evolved. So now when we talk about men and women, it's men and women in all their diversity. And this is the approach we should use. And then in the Equality Body Directive, we managed even to have in the Article 6 the definition of victims. We had the 3 words: gender expression, gender identity, and sex characteristics, also to protect intersex people. So there is progress, and we have to continue working on that. But it's interesting how the trans community is suffering, and especially trans women compared to trans men. And there you see again, it's the whole patriarchal system which we have to deconstruct and work on. But thank you for your question, and it's very important to fight also for the rights of trans women, because they are really being scapegoated all over the place now. Thank you.
Okay, I see we open more and more topics, and it's getting deep. So yes, one more remark.
Yeah, on trans women, I mean, I wanted to maybe start where you end, because also on this issue on family values, I think we also must understand that violence against women and domestic violence is gender-based violence, and it's I mean, the society and what we are seeing, as you're explaining, is it follows this, which the directive also defined, that violence is based on this historical, roles, historical, the persisting manifestation of structural discrimination against women resulting from historically unequal power relations between women and men. So the gender inequalities is the reason, basically, for the gender-based violence, the violence against women. And that's where we need to start if we want to end this. So I think that's important to remember. So when it comes, I want to also say something about the first question, basically, that this is not about family values. What really destroys families is violence. That's what we have to keep saying. I've seen this myself as a prosecutor handling these crimes for years. And then we need to keep on stressing that the only purpose of the Istanbul Convention, of the Violence Against Women Directive, is to ensure that women and girls have the right to live safe without violence, which was also in the roadmap for women's rights. So there can be no gender equality without freedom from violence. So I think we need to link this with the gender inequalities that exists and see that this is where we need to start the prevention as well. And this needs to start from very early ages. And this is also a requirement under the directive, that they need to be included in the society, in education from the first years. And this is where we need to start this change. And then when it comes to the issue of trans women, of course, the directive applies to women in all their diversity. The definition of violence against women, you can read that in Article 2. And also domestic violence is gender actually neutral, the definition of domestic violence. But the directive also specifies in Article 33 that women experiencing intersectional discrimination are at an increased risk of violence, and therefore they have the right to further protection. Member states need to protect them increasingly. And here trans women are also mentioned in recital 36, I think it is, specifically. So I think they're very much covered by and included in the directive. Should we go on to the other questions, or do you want to? I wanted to say something about police.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think about the police, you can continue with that one.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Also, of course, as a former prosecutor, of course, this is super important. And here, I think the main recommendation from Grevio is that we need to ensure that all law enforcement, all police are trained. And that's also now a requirement under the directive, that they all need to get training, because you have to, as a police officer, understand the gender dimension of this violence. You cannot handle these crimes like any other crimes. We need to leave the picture that some police would have, that there are no witnesses because there were only 2 persons in the room. Like, this is old-fashioned. If you are a trained police, you would come to a room or a house, and you would know that you can prove these crimes by just having the stories of the 2 persons, because there may be other sources of evidence. And that's why you have to be trained, so you know that you have to listen if there are neighbors, maybe you knock doors. You have to act quickly so that all the bruises, etc., are documented. And they also, you have to document the apartment to see that maybe she's saying that he threw a share on her. And then if there is laying a share there, you need to document this. I mean, I did this in my own case, and like by very small changes, you can see that you're actually able to prove these crimes, and it doesn't have to be that complex. Maybe she wrote a diary and explained what had happened before. Maybe she spoke with friends about it, who also saw the signs or the bruises. So, and for this we need training. So that I think is very clear in the directive, that even actually now judiciary needs to be trained on this. And here I think we can really expect a change. And then there, of course, also need to be resources in place to handle these crimes. And I was actually happy because I discussed with the police this summer. When I worked as a prosecutor, this was not the most attractive crimes to handle as police officers because, you know, they always take back their stories, blah, blah, blah. I just heard that actually nowadays in Sweden, this is one of the areas where really young police, this is a very attractive area to work in because Sweden have been starting to handle this, giving it resources, handling it as serious crimes, and handling these cases as they handle other serious crimes like gang shootings, etc. Actually meaning that they work preventive as well. So they are starting to knock on doors when they know there is a victim. They are starting to try to reach out to victims to support them in holding on to their stories. And here I think, as I said before, that the whole society needs to see its role here, because we cannot ask women to go to the police and then the next day, I mean, the same day, go back home and sleep next to the perpetrator. They have to be safe. Perpetrators cannot, I mean, we cannot, women need to be safe because otherwise they will not be able to hold on to the stories within the criminal justice system. And here, the society has a responsibility, but because of the gender inequalities are the reasons for this, then the society also needs to take responsibility when it happens and supports the victims. And also the preventive measures, as I mentioned. Thank you.
Perhaps we can move on with the question we received from that part of the room with the one more case that you just mentioned. Who would like to speak on that? Would you like to repeat probably the intention of the question?
Sure. My question was more about like how judicial systems fail to protect us women, and that kind of reduces our faith in seeking support. So what sort of protection mechanisms needs to be changed or reintroduced so that we as women, and especially those that are marginalized, can support and have trust in these systems to protect us?
All right. Okay.
Well, maybe some. I think first of all, one thing is about what does consent mean. That's also something we have to look at. We just adopted a report about what consent means, and no, it means no. But I think a lot of issues were just tackled. How does the system work? In the Netherlands, for example, we now have places where you can go as a woman, where you can discuss what happened to you, and then in that same building there's also the police, but there's also psychologists, there's also people who can do research, so everything is centered around one place, and it's really based on the victim's experience. Because too often we indeed hear that people go to the police, they feel like they're not taken seriously, etc. So it's all already, it starts with the way you set up the system in your own member state. So have more of these integrated centers, I think, is a good start, and then especially training your police in recognizing it, but also taking it seriously. One thing that I found very interesting, I don't know if this will work, yes or no, is that now in the Netherlands, before we had shelters where women could stay for a while, and it was a secret location. But now, what they do now is that they make these places in the open, to take away the shame part, and also if everything is secretive, then women tend to still go back to their partners that abuse them. And by taking away this taboo, they, at least in Amsterdam, this is happening in Amsterdam, have the idea that it is a way to prevent women from going back to the perpetrator. And I'm very curious how this in the long term will work out and how this is working in other countries. So yeah, I think we have to make some changes about consent, about the way when you want to file a complaint, and about these centers. So it's a whole of society, whole of chain approach, I would say.
Can I just add something to that? I also think we need to change the way we talk about these matters, because often when we talk about sexual violence, domestic violence, it's about the victim. I've been through hundreds of news articles covering cases of femicide, and what we always see is the picture of the victim, right? We, I think, need to start talking about the perpetrator. It's not a shame to be a victim of such abuse. But it's often talked in such ways. We need to talk about the shame of being a perpetrator. I think we really need to shift the culture in how we talk about these matters and start looking at the case of the perpetrator. What turns a man into an abuser, right, in any form or way? And it needs to, in a sense, in society, tackled very differently than the way we do now. And that would lift a lot of the pressure on the victim, right?
Would anyone like to take the floor for this question? Remark.
Yeah, with risk of repeating myself, I also think this idea of having a place, like a one-stop shop, as we call it in the directive, where women can go so that they don't have to go around, to really, and I think also the directive is clear because it speaks about specialist support to victims, that we have to understand the dynamics of especially intimate partner violence, that it affects the whole woman's life. So in order for her to stay through the procedure and to leave the partner, she needs a lot of support from society. And that must be given to the person. And it's clear, I think, in the directive that there need to be, housing possibilities, education, childcare, financial support and assistance, possibilities to find an employment, etc. Because if this is not there, the victim will not be able to hold on to her story because she will not be safe. And I also think it's right to speak about perpetrators. And when the Istanbul Convention came, it was clear that through the provisions on emergency bearing orders and other kinds of orders, the idea was that women should be able, and with the children, to stay in the house, and it should be the perpetrator that was not allowed to enter the house. So it was a shift in this thinking. And I'm very much support, and I think that's very important. But I also think it's important to remember that, we see that there are several femicides in Europe every week. So the orders are just as effective as they are respected. And this goes beyond the EU competence, but I think pretrial detention needs to be applied in these cases. The woman needs to be free, she needs to be able to be out there, and it should be the perpetrator that should be taken away during the investigations. I think that's crucial because you cannot ask anything else. And this is a shift because I keep on hearing that all over Europe, men are still not taken to pretrial detention during investigations of very serious crimes. And we know that the three most dangerous words a woman can say is, "I leave you." And also during these investigations, if they are reporting the violence, it's a super dangerous situation. And here we really need to change. I think that need to be a shift here in the support from society to these persons. And then I also think, for instance, leaving programs, really helping victims to leave is super important. And speaking about perpetrator, also the directive foresees that there need to be perpetrator programs for persons who have not yet been convicted of these crimes. Thank you.
Well, thank you for replying to all the questions. And to the ones that we have missed, probably, unfortunately, we'll have to leave the room very, very soon, in a couple of minutes. So keep your thoughts, though. Keep your questions, keep your ideas. And also, we'll have some time while leaving the room to discuss between us, but we'll have to close the Q&A session.
Unless Mr. Markangel wants to add something, I will go towards the final remarks. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude today's discussion, I would like to sincerely thank our speakers and all of you for joining us and sharing your perspectives. Today has reminded us that protecting women from violence is about far more than legal text. It is about dignity, safety, and the fundamental principle that no one should be left behind and unprotected, especially in times of growing polarization and uncertainty. We have heard clear examples of how a strong implementation, effective institutions, and engaged civil society can turn the standards of the Istanbul Convention into real protection for women. These discussions show that solutions do exist, but they rely on political will, accountability, and collective action. Importantly, we have also chosen not to let this conversation end here. We have turned this discussion into action by preparing an open letter addressed to the Council of Europe, calling for stronger implementation of the Istanbul Convention and renewed commitment from all member states. We will send this letter to our fellow MEPs, but also everyone that is interested, please let us know. Thank you once again to MEP Anna Strollenberg for co-hosting, to our speakers for their valuable insights, and to Anna Maria and Reich and our teams for making this event possible. And thank you, the participants. Your engagement is what ensures these issues remain visible, urgent, and impossible to ignore. And finally, I'd like to conclude this address on a personal note. At the end of the day, I'm a man at the panel about women's rights. I'm a Gen Z man also, but I'm also a brother, a son, and a grandson, and I deeply hope that one day every woman in the world will be able to benefit from the protection that this document provides. That's why men, like me, should support this effort. It is our responsibility to make this hope a reality. Thank you for your attention and good afternoon.